Lizzie was 11 years old, and she was going to school hungry every single day. Not because her mother didn't feed her, but because her teacher was eating her food and threatening to fail her if she ever told anyone. What happened when her mother finally found out will blow your mind. To find out more about this, please kindly hit the like button, share, subscribe, and press the notification bell so you never miss a thing. Now let's dive into today's story. Mrs. Clare ate the children's food. Not occasionally, not accidentally, not in moments of desperate hunger. She did it with purpose, with habit, and worst of all, with absolutely zero shame. Every single day, when the lunch bell rang at 12:30 p.m., and the children of Primary 4 lined up at the back of the class to collect their lunchboxes, Mrs. Clare would push back her chair slowly, smooth down her skirt, and walk that line like a general inspecting her troops. Her eyes, sharp, calculating, hungry, would scan each box the way a market woman scans tomatoes, looking for the ripest, the best, the most desirable. And then she would stop. "Open it," she would say. And the child, trembling, stomach already sinking, would open the box. "Is that jollof rice with turkey?" she would ask, though she could already smell it from 3 steps away. "Your mother cooks very well. Let me just taste small." Taste small. Those 2 words were the most terrifying words in Primary 4. Because Mrs. Clare's taste small was never small. She kept a large serving spoon in the top drawer of her desk, a spoon she had bought specifically, deliberately, with full intention, and she would dig into a child's lunch with it, scooping generously, eating slowly, chewing with her eyes half closed, like someone savoring a meal at a 5-star restaurant. Then she would hand the box back, half empty, sometimes devastatingly worse, wipe her mouth with the small white handkerchief she kept tucked in her sleeve, and move on without a single word of apology. The children were too afraid to speak, too afraid to cry openly, too afraid to do anything but stand there, holding their half-empty boxes, watching their lunch disappear into a teacher who was supposed to protect them. Among all the children in Primary 4, nobody suffered more quietly than 11-year-old Lizzie Pemberton. Lizzie was a small, gentle girl with 2 thick braids and the biggest, most expressive eyes in the entire school. She was the kind of child who apologized when someone else bumped into her. The kind of child who shared her last biscuit without being asked. Her mother, Mrs. Favor Pemberton, was a hard-working caterer who packed the most legendary lunchboxes in Sunshine Academy. Coconut fried rice with crispy chicken, egusi soup with soft pounded yam wrapped in foil, jollof spaghetti with beef and fried plantain on the side. Every single day, Favor woke up at 5 in the morning, humming worship songs in her kitchen, packing love and sacrifice into a small plastic box for her daughter. And every single day, Mrs. Clare Whitmore ate most of it. Lizzie had been coming home hungry for 2 solid months. She would sit at the dinner table in the evening, eating with a desperation that broke her mother's heart, without her mother even knowing why. "Lizzie, did you not eat your lunch today?" Favor would ask, watching her daughter devour dinner like someone who had not seen food since morning. "I ate, Mommy," Lizzie would whisper, and that was the truth. She had eaten, just not much, just whatever crumbs Mrs. Clare had decided to leave behind on any particular day. She never told the full truth, because Mrs. Clare had made something very clear on the very first day she took Lizzie's food. She had leaned down, close enough that Lizzie could smell the stew still on her breath, and whispered, "If you go home and open your mouth about what happens in my class, I will make sure you fail every single subject this term. I will make sure you repeat Primary 4, and nobody will believe a small girl over a teacher. Do you understand me?" Lizzie had nodded, tears burning behind her eyes. She understood. The other children understood too. Shedrack Bellamy, the class captain, a bold, stocky boy who normally feared nothing, had tried to report Mrs. Clare to the vice principal 3 weeks earlier, He had walked into the office with his chest puffed out and his half-eaten lunchbox as evidence. But Mrs. Clare had gotten there first. By the time Shadrach arrived, Mrs. Clare was already seated across from the vice principal, laughing softly, describing how Shadrach had been behaving very badly in class lately and telling lies to get attention. Shadrach had stood in that office, lunchbox in hand, and watched the vice principal look at him with suspicious eyes. He walked out defeated. After that, nobody tried again. Nobody until the day everything changed. It was a hot Tuesday afternoon in October when Favor Pemberton noticed something that no amount of silence could hide. She had packed Lizzie's favorite meal that morning, a full portion of ofada rice with ayamasi sauce, 2 large pieces of fried goat meat, and a small container of cold Zobo drink. She had packed it with extra care because Lizzie had a mathematics test that day and needed her full energy. When Lizzie came home that evening, the lunchbox came back clean, wiped. Not even a grain of rice remained. But Lizzie's eyes were red. Favor sat down slowly across from her daughter at the kitchen table. She did not ask about lunch. She did not ask about the test. She simply reached across, took Lizzie's small hands in hers, and said very quietly, "Baby, tell Mummy the truth. All of it." And Lizzie, 2 months of hunger, 2 months of fear, 2 months of walking to school with a full box and coming home with an empty stomach and an even emptier spirit, finally broke. She wept so hard her whole body shook. And as the words poured out of her, Favor Pemberton's expression changed. The softness left her face. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes went still and dark, in the way that only a Nigerian mother's eyes can go when someone has hurt her child and thought they would get away with it. She said nothing that night, but she picked up her phone and made 3 calls. By the next morning, Favor Pemberton had a plan. She had not slept much. She had spent most of the night sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of cold tea she forgot to drink, thinking, praying, and feeling a slow, steady fire build inside her chest. She was not a violent woman. She was not a screaming woman. She had built her catering business from nothing, with patience and dignity, and she intended to handle this situation with the same weapons: patience, dignity, and something extra that Mrs. Clare Whitmore would never see coming. The 3 calls she made the night before had been important ones. The first was to Mrs. Sandra Holloway, Shadrach's mother, a sharp-tongued, no-nonsense woman who had never quite believed her son's story had been fairly heard. The second was to Mr. Desmond Croft, father of a quiet boy named Peter Croft in Primary 4, who had mentioned to his father once that teacher likes to eat our food and had been dismissed as exaggerating. The third call was the most important one. It was to a woman named Mrs. Agatha Pennington, the new proprietress of Sunshine Academy, who had taken over the school just 6 weeks earlier after the former owner retired. Mrs. Agatha was fresh, sharp, and had made it clear from her very first assembly that she ran a zero-tolerance school. She had not yet heard about Mrs. Clare's lunchbox habits, but she was about to. Favor did not go to the school that morning screaming and waving her hands. She went quietly, smartly dressed, with a small bag over her shoulder and a calm expression that hid everything burning underneath. She had also packed Lizzie's lunchbox that morning with extraordinary care. Jollof rice, the kind that made the whole street smell like a celebration. Perfectly seasoned, cooked with fresh tomatoes and a blend of spices that Favor had perfected over 15 years of catering. 2 pieces of grilled chicken, golden and fragrant. A small cup of moi moi, soft and warm, and a chilled bottle of juice on the side. It was, without question, the most beautiful lunch in Primary 4. It was also, unknown to Mrs. Clare Whitmore, bait. Before Lizzie left for school, Favor knelt down in front of her daughter and looked her straight in the eyes. "Listen to me," she said softly. "Today, when that woman comes to take your food, you let her. You don't cry, you don't say anything. You just let her take it. Can you do that for Mommy?" Lizzie swallowed hard. "Yes, Mommy." "Good girl." Favor kissed her forehead. "Today is the last day, I promise you." What Mrs. Clare did not know was that Mrs. Agatha Pennington had agreed, after hearing Favor's account the previous evening, to personally visit Primary 4 during lunch break. Not announced, not with fanfare, just a quiet visit, to see things for herself. What Mrs. Clare also did not know was that Mr. Desmond Croft, who worked in video production, had lent Favor a small, discreet device that could be placed inside a lunchbox, a tiny button camera, barely visible, that would record everything within a meter of it. Lizzie carried it to school in her bag, her heart hammering. The morning crawled by. Mathematics, English composition, social studies. Mrs. Clare taught with her usual thunderous authority, completely unaware that this particular Tuesday was different from all the others. When the lunch bell finally rang at 12:30 p.m., the children of Primary 4 moved to collect their boxes with the usual heaviness. Shadrach caught Lizzie's eye across the room. She gave him a tiny nod. He straightened up slightly, confused but alert. Mrs. Clare rose from her chair. She smoothed her skirt. She walked the line. She smelled Lizzie's box before she even reached her. The smell of Favor's jollof rice rose into the air like a song. Mrs. Clare's eyes lit up in a way that would have been almost comical if it weren't so deeply wrong. She reached into her drawer, pulled out her spoon. "Your mother really knows how to cook," she murmured, already scooping. She took the rice. She took a full piece of chicken. She took the moi moi. She ate it standing there, over Lizzie's open lunchbox, while Lizzie stood perfectly still, eyes forward, just as her mother had instructed. The camera recorded everything. And at that precise moment, as Mrs. Clare was chewing the last of the moi moi with her eyes closed in satisfaction, the classroom door opened. Mrs. Agatha Pennington walked in. She was a compact woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of quiet presence that made a room rearrange itself. She stood in the doorway and took in the scene in 3 seconds flat. The teacher, the spoon, the half-empty lunchbox, the child standing like a small statue, and 23 other children frozen, like they had all stopped breathing at exactly the same time. Mrs. Clare turned around. The spoon was still in her hand. The silence that followed was the loudest thing that classroom had ever heard. For a long, terrible moment, nobody moved. Mrs. Clare Whitmore stood in the middle of Primary 4 with a serving spoon in her hand and another woman's child's food in her stomach, and she looked at Mrs. Agatha Pennington with an expression that cycled through 5 emotions in under 4 seconds. Surprise, confusion, calculation, and then, finally, a desperate attempt at composure. "Mrs. Agatha," she said, forcing a smile, Lizzie offered me some of her food. The children sometimes share with me. It's a kind gesture, really. I always—" "Lizzie." Mrs. Agatha's voice was quiet, dangerously quiet. She did not look at Mrs. Clare. She looked directly at Lizzie. "Did you offer your teacher your food today?" Lizzie stood up straight. Her braids were neat. Her eyes were clear. 2 months of fear looked back at the proprietress. And then, for the first time, Lizzie Pemberton decided she was done being afraid. The words fell into the room like stones into still water. 23 children exhaled at the same time. And then, one by one, like a dam breaking slowly and then all at once, hands went up across the classroom. Shadrach Bellamy's hand, up. Favor's daughter, Peter Croft's shy little sister who had transferred to this class just last month, her hand, up. Child after child after child, hands rising. 2 months of swallowed truth finally surfacing. Mrs. Clare turned to face them, and for the first time in 11 years of terrorizing Primary 4, she looked genuinely afraid. "They're exaggerating," she said quickly, turning back to Mrs. Agatha. "Children do this. They dramatize things." "Mrs. Clare?" Mrs. Agatha held up one hand. "Please, put the spoon down." It was such a simple, small instruction, but the way she said it, calm, absolute, final, made Mrs. Clare's hand drop to her side immediately. The spoon clattered softly against the desk. What happened next unfolded over the following 2 hours with the quiet, thorough precision of someone who had managed institutions long enough to know exactly how to handle a crisis. Mrs. Agatha personally walked every child in Primary 4 to the school's small conference room. She sat with them, not in a formal interrogation, but in a calm, gentle circle, and she listened. She listened to Shedrack describe going to the vice principal and being dismissed. She listened to a girl named Joy Harrington describe crying in the bathroom every afternoon because she was too hungry to concentrate in the last 2 lessons of the day. She listened to a boy named Felix Drummond say that he had started hiding biscuits in his socks to eat secretly during afternoon lessons because he knew his lunch would be taken. Hiding food in his socks. A 10-year-old child. Mrs. Agatha wrote everything down in a small notebook with a steady hand and a very still face. But those who watched her closely could see the way her jaw tightened with every new account. Then, Mr. Desmond Croft arrived at the school. Favor had called him the moment Mrs. Agatha walked into the classroom, and he sat with the proprietress and played the recording from the button camera. There was Mrs. Clare on the small screen, spoon in hand, helping herself to Lizzie's lunch with the relaxed confidence of someone who had done this 100 times before. There was Lizzie, standing perfectly still. There was Mrs. Clare, eating, nodding in appreciation, wiping her mouth with her handkerchief. The vice principal, who had been summoned and was now sitting in the corner of the office, watching the recording, went very pale. He was the one who had dismissed Shedrack 3 weeks ago. He was the one who had looked at a child with a half-eaten lunchbox and chosen to believe the teacher instead. He said nothing, but he understood from the way Mrs. Agatha glanced at him once and then looked away, that his own position in this school had just become considerably less comfortable. Mrs. Claire Whitmore was called into the office at 3 p.m., just as the school day was ending. Favor Pemberton was already there, seated. Beside her sat Mrs. Sandra Holloway, Shedrack's mother, arms folded, expression like cold iron. The recording had already been played. The children's statements had already been taken. There was no version of events left for Mrs. Clare to construct. She walked in and saw the faces in the room, and she knew. 11 years, Mrs. Agatha said, after a silence that stretched long enough to be its own kind of punishment. You have worked at this school for 11 years. And in those 11 years, how many children sat in your classroom hungry because you took their food? Mrs. Clare opened her mouth. That was not a question that requires your answer, Mrs. Agatha said softly. It was a question I am asking myself. What followed was not a shouting match. There was no drama, no screaming, no chairs thrown. Favor Pemberton, who had every right to unleash 11 years of Lagos market woman fury on this woman, sat quietly, with her hands folded in her lap. Because she had already won. She had won the moment Lizzie held her head up and said, "No, ma'am," in a clear voice. Mrs. Claire Whitmore was suspended immediately, pending a full disciplinary review. Her classroom keys were collected before she left the building. Parents were to be formally notified. The matter was also to be reported to the State Teaching Service Commission, because what Mrs. Clare had done was not merely bad behavior. It was a sustained, deliberate abuse of authority over children who had no power to defend themselves. As Mrs. Clare walked out of the office, no longer tall, no longer broad, somehow smaller than she had ever appeared in that classroom, she passed Lizzie in the corridor. Lizzie was standing with her mother, Favor's arm wrapped around her small shoulders. Mrs. Clare stopped. For a moment, something moved across her face, something that might, in another version of this story, have been the beginning of genuine remorse. She looked at Lizzie, at the child she had stolen from, threatened, and silenced for 2 months. Lizzie looked back at her. And then Lizzie did something that nobody in that corridor expected. She said quietly, "I forgive you, Ma." Not because what Mrs. Clare had done was acceptable, not because it didn't hurt, but because Lizzie Pemberton was her mother's daughter, and Favor had raised her to understand that carrying bitterness was its own kind of hunger. a worse kind. Mrs. Clare walked out of Sunshine Academy without another word. 3 weeks later, Primary 4 had a new teacher, a young, energetic woman named Miss Karina Bassi, who brought homemade chin-chin for the class on her first day and told the children that her only rule was simple. This classroom is safe. Whatever you feel, whatever happens, you can always speak. On her first lunch break, the children opened their lunchboxes freely, laughing and trading bites of each other's food willingly, the way children are supposed to. Shedrack ate his mother's fried rice down to the very last grain and leaned back in his chair with a satisfied grin. Lizzie ate every single bite of her mother's coconut rice, and when she was done, she closed her empty box slowly and smiled at it, the smile of a child who finally, fully got to enjoy what was hers. And somewhere across Lagos, in her kitchen at 5 in the morning, Favor Pemberton packed her daughter's lunchbox and hummed her worship song. And this time, for the first time in 2 months, she hummed it without worry, because her child would come home satisfied. And that, for a mother, is everything.